Good morning, class. Today's lesson is on aggregate demand. And we've got three keys that I want to express here today. First up, we want to be clear on what aggregate demand measures and what this actually represents. We'll take a few minutes going over that. Second up, you're going to see that the aggregate demand curve is almost always modeled in the same way. It's always drawn downward sloping. And this is going to look really similar to the demand curves that you're familiar with from microeconomics, but the logic behind this and our explanations for why it takes this pattern are totally different. So secondly, we want to think about why aggregate demand slopes down as it does. And then the third objective here in this little mini lecture is to explain and think about why aggregate demand matters. Right? Why is it that we're going over this model and what's it used for? All right. So to begin with, aggregate demand represents a schedule. It's going to show us the relationship between total spending that you see in the economy and the price level, right? So this total spending that you see, as the term aggregate in the name is suggesting, is going to be the sum of all spending on all different goods and services that are coming from all sources. So it's going to include consumption spending. Aggregate demand will include investment spending, government spending, as well as spending from folks living in other countries. So net exports are involved as well. And we're going to see how that total spending changes with the existence of inflation, a rising price level, or deflation, a falling price level. All right. So you can see here on the board, I've got a typical aggregate demand curve, and we can see the conventional way that this is modeled, right? So take note that up here on the vertical axis, we're going to have the price level. Again, that's not the price of any one particular good or service, but instead a measure of the average costs of goods and services. Horizontally, rather than the quantity of one particular good, we're going to have the value of all the goods and services that end up being purchased. Right? So the way to measure that is with real GDP. Right? The line then that we've got here on the graph represents aggregate demand. And the big takeaway is just what I've written here on the board, which is that when you move higher on the graph, the price level goes up, meaning you see some inflation. It results in the total sum of spending falling. Right? So as you see higher prices, people buy less stuff. That's the big message here with the aggregate demand curve. All right. So I think it's fairly easy to see that just based on the curve here. It's less clear, though, why that's the case. What is it about inflation taking place, in other words, that causes people to actually buy less stuff? Right? Slide this over, and you guys are going to see here that we've got three key explanations for why aggregate demand is, in fact, downward sloping. All right, so the first one that explains this pattern is something called the real balances effect. The real balances effect works like this. It tells us that when you see inflation and we're getting a higher price level, the value of any saved balance of money declines, right? So if you've got $100 sitting in your piggy bank at home today, in the event that some inflation takes place, it means that that $100 from your piggy bank buys you fewer goods and services, right? So inflation reduces the purchasing power of some saved balances of money, and as a consequence, reduces our total spending. There you go. That's the real balances effect. Second reason why higher prices correlate with reduced total spending is something called the interest rate effect. The idea here behind this interest rate effect is that as inflation takes place, we end up seeing higher and higher interest rates in the economy. One reason for this is because when inflation occurs, people try to borrow money at higher rates. Right? People are interested in maintaining their current lifestyle and current levels of consumption. And so as inflation takes place and real balances fall in value, people are going to borrow more. As people borrow more, that drives up interest rates. Right? And then to connect this back to total spending, we know that there's all kinds of different sources of spending that are interest rate sensitive. Right? So as that interest rate goes higher, it makes buying a new car potentially more expensive, or buying a house potentially more expensive, or borrowing money to redo your kitchen potentially more expensive. Right? All these reasons. All these are examples of higher interest rates leading to reduced spending. which is just what we see along that downward sloping aggregate demand curve. Third reason why aggregate demand slopes down is something called the foreign purchases effect. The idea here is that when you see inflation in the home country, it results in that country's goods being more expensive for foreigners. So if we see inflation in the US, it would mean then that American-made cars and computers and things like that become that much more expensive to Canadian consumers or Mexican consumers or European consumers or whatever. Right? So as that inflation pushes up the cost of American-made goods, exports flowing from the US abroad end up falling. Right? Consumers in other parts of the world have incentive to reduce their spending on American-made goods, in other words. So inflation reduces American exports abroad, and at the same time, American consumers now have higher incentives to buy foreign-made products. Right? So as an example, if you see inflation at home without corresponding inflation in Europe, that means that for all of us as American consumers, those European goods suddenly become relatively cheaper, right? So we would then have a greater incentive to buy European-made goods at the expense of American-made goods. So then the impact at the end of the day is that imports going from Europe or other parts of the world into the US end up rising, right? And so these two things together result in a reduction in the total spending on American-made goods, right? Foreigners end up buying fewer American-made goods, right? Reducing total spending in the United States. And Americans end up buying more stuff from foreign countries, right? So both those things serve to reduce total spending at home. Okay. Takeaway then, guys, is that there's these three reasons why aggregate demand slopes down as it does. The last learning objective for our mini lecture here today is to be clear on why aggregate demand is so significant. Well, later in the class, in the last half of the class, we're going to start getting to analysis of policy options that the government has to try to fix the economy. Right? So suppose we want to fight inflation, or suppose we want to do something to stimulate spending, or to reduce unemployment, right? We need some framework by which we're going to try to predict whether these policies are going to be effective or not so effective, right? And in fact, aggregate demand and correspondingly aggregate supply is the model that we use most often to make some predictions about the likely effectiveness of policy, right? So think of chapter 30 here. This stuff on aggregate demand and aggregate supply is sort of laying the groundwork for maybe the more interesting questions that we'll get in 31 and later on in terms of analyzing public policy. There we have it. Adios.